Okay, so let's see. Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Again, many of you already know who I am. My name is Simon Casares. I am the team leader broker for the South Bay office, the coastal office, and also the Valley offices as well. Today's topic is going to touch on seller refusing and limited entry, understanding the buyer's contractual right of entry, right? And really, what the key is, can a seller refuse access to the property after acceptance? After an acceptance of an offer, right? And what are the consequences that may stir up from it? All right. So we're going to dive deep into this conversation because I think it's important, but more so it's to educate your clients the do's and don'ts and ultimately to avoid any type of dispute or potential litigation as well, right? So, if a seller is trying to sell a property, why would the seller refuse someone from allowing them to go into the property, right? After an offer has been accepted. So we'll dive into the conversation so you'll get a better understanding and how all of this works. Right. So what we're going to be discussing today is very, very simple. Understanding the buyer's rights, know the buyer's contract right of entry under the purchase agreement and when it applies, explaining the seller obligations, right? Articulating the exact what the seller agrees to once an offer is accepted, recognizing the breach and the risk and the liability that sometimes may occur, right? Identifying when limited or refusing access across can potentially be a breach of the contract, right? And then obviously know the limits, right? Understand when an attorney has to be involved and it's required to stay within the license scope as real estate professionals that we are, right? We don't practice law, okay? We don't practice taxations and give legal or any tax advice as well. Okay. All right. So where is this in the purchase agreement? Okay. So the language is on a couple places, and then after our presentation, I'll definitely go into the actual form and I'll pinpoint where this language is on the purchase agreement. Okay, so it's in there in many, many places on the grid and also on a paragraph, right? So part of it is on paragraph 12A. 12A, right? Buyer's investigation and contingencies, right? Under the paragraph 12A, excuse me, 12A, the buyer is expressly permitted to conduct a wide range of investigations during the contingency period. So, yeah, the whole purpose of today's session is to really understand if you submit an offer, right? You're not going to buy the property sight unseen, right? You're going to submit an offer with the intent and the purpose. Hey, I got to do my due diligence. I want to know exactly what I'm getting myself. It's no difference than buying a vehicle, a used vehicle, right? You're not just going to take the seller's word that the pictures and the images on, on an ad is sufficient enough for me to just throw money and anticipate that the vehicle is in good condition, right? You're going to test drive it. You're going to open up the doors. You're going to open up the hood, check and visualize everything, right? And then go on a test drive as well, right? Well, it's no difference than real estate, right? Real estate is kind of the same elements, right? It's the process of getting your offer accepted and then more so going through the buyer's due diligence period, right? So the contract in the rights of it is that the right of the entry is in not a favorable extent of the seller, right? It's not I'm doing you a favor by allowing you accepted the offer, so you're buying the property, okay? The way it is, right? And yes, there's language that says that the property is being sold in as this condition, and we get that, right? We understand that all properties are sold in as this condition, but the mere fact is a seller cannot just refuse to allow the buyer, right, not to have access to the property, right? Because there is contractual limitations when it comes to that. How you doing? You're uh, 1 second. What are we trying to do? No, no. What do you can leave it open. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I saw you with glasses.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like, wait a minute, you're confusing me here a little bit.
I thought you had a glass cover.
Yeah, well, it's a slide. It's like, okay, are we trying to open it or are we trying to close it? Everyone, this is Lynn. She just joined us, KW South Bay. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for being here. All right. So again, the essence is a seller and a listing agent cannot refuse a buyer after acceptance, right? You have to allow the buyer to do their due diligence to make sure that they know exactly what they're getting themselves into, right? Because if you don't allow that, then the buyer has every right to now go after the seller for refusal, right? But what is it that the seller's contractor duty is? Once a seller accepts the offer, right, they enter into what's called a binding agreement. And the agreement includes specific obligations that allows the buyer access to the property, right? The seller agrees to one, make the property available, right? Two, cooperate with the inspections. Guess what? The buyer can do any and all inspections necessary to make sure that they're completely satisfied with the overall condition of the property. If that means a general home inspection, if that means a sewer inspection, if that means a roof inspection, if that means plumbing and electrical inspection, if that means verifying HOA documentations, the bylaws, the CCNRs, that's part of the process, and we cannot deny the buyer the right to these inspections, right? Because one, it compromises the integrity of the process, and more so now the buyer has ammunition to go after the seller because now they found out that there was something wrong. They could have prevented, negotiated, had the seller fix or repair, or they could have easily backed out. But now that the deal closed, now they have some ammunition to go after the seller for damages. Okay.
There's only one inspector that the buyer can't have without the seller's written permission.
Which is that?
The city inspector.
Mm.
Okay. The city inspector, they need the seller's written permission.
Yeah.
And the rationale behind that.
Yeah.
That if the city inspector comes and finds something that is improper,
right,
the city is now on record. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you don't want to break a city inspector in.
It has to be mutually agreed by all parties. But yeah, you're absolutely, and all cities are different. Not all cities require a pre-inspection or the city to be involved, because as Steve mentioned, there may open up a can of worms, right? But also it may be an advantage to the buyer, right? Because what is it that we don't know? What did the seller do that was not part of the process with the city, right? Unpermitted work to the property, right? Especially significant things, right? Such as add-ons, ADUs, adding additional bedrooms or bathrooms, right? Without getting the initial permits can definitely open up a can of worms, right? And I've seen transactions where a seller doesn't think, gets someone that knows how to do a modification ADU, converts the garage into a dwelling, never got permits, never went to the city, didn't hire a general contractor. And now 5, 7 years later, they totally forgot, right? And now they're ready to sell the property. And now they didn't realize that the city had to be involved. The city goes in there. It's like they look at their documentations from history of things that this property has, and they realize, I don't remember seeing a ADU conversion. This was a garage at one point, right? And then they open up the scope of, okay, tell us a little bit more. And one instance, I remember they had to tear it all down. And I think they spent like $50,000, $60,000. And yeah, they had to convert it back to a garage. How unfortunate. The deal ended up falling apart because the buyer had the intent that they needed that extra dwelling for additional family, right? And so the whole deal fell apart because the city got involved. Yes.
Something like that happens, is that at the expense of the buyer or at the expense of the seller?
It's typically the expense of the buyer. Because the buyer, no. So the expense is the seller.
Yeah, if
Yeah.
the city comes in and say you got to tear this down because it wasn't permitted.
Yeah.
Who has to pay?
Well, typically the responsibility falls on the seller.
'Cause
But
they were-
Yeah.
Negotiated.
Yeah.
Be negotiated.
Yeah. And to Steve's point, yeah, I mean, if the buyer truly wants it and is willing to take the gamble and the risk on it, then yeah, they can take on the blunt of it and deal with the city directly. Yeah. But it's very far and few that happens because, it could cost thousands of dollars, right? And it's not just an easy fix. I'm going to sign off on it. That can take, weeks, even months before you get the final approval. And that might mean opening up and exposing plumbing and electrical and structure and all that fun stuff. So, yeah, just be mindful of those situations. But going back to Steve's point, yeah, there's certain things that, the seller can ultimately ask the buyer to waive. Now, does that mean that the buyer has to waive it? No. So that means they either have to make a decision to move forward or decide to retract and back out and cancel and go find another property. Okay. The seller cannot simply decide no inspections, right? Blocking third-party inspectors from entering the property, no appraisal, right? Refusing entry on a lender appraiser without written agreement. So let me ask you this question. Okay. Let's say it's a cash deal. I submit a cash offer to you, right? We get the offer accepted, right? We're going through the process. I never checked off waiving my appraisal contingency. Bear in mind, this is an all cash deal. But then I changed my mind and says, you know what? I think I want to get an appraisal done. Okay. And I still have my appraisal contingency still intact, but it's a cash deal, right? Can the seller refuse from me doing an appraisal on a cash deal? Because remember, with cash, it eliminates all of the conditions that a lender would have, right? What we call the red tape.
Was the
Can-
offer accepted?
The offer is accepted. Yeah. Can the seller refuse the buyer from doing an appraisal? How many people say yes? How many people say no? How many people say I do not know? Okay. So the answer is no. You cannot refuse a buyer from doing an appraisal if the buyer still has an appraisal contingency in place. Well, what if the seller allows the appraisal to be conducted and they realize that the appraised value is less than what their offer is? Can the buyer, in this case, again being a cash offer, can the buyer negotiate a lower price? Okay. Yeah. So how many people say, yeah, you can definitely renegotiate? I don't know the answer, Simon, or no, the seller cannot renegotiate because it's a cash offer. So the answer is yes, they can negotiate term as long as the buyer has their appraisal intact. Man, that's the safe haven. That's your protection layer, right? That allows one, the buyer to do an appraisal. Two, it allows them to get the evaluation and determine if they paid over or under, right? But yeah, it also gives the buyer the opportunity to renegotiate a different price if the appraised value is a lot less than what their actual offer is, right? Okay, so just be mindful of that. No buyers preventing the buyer from attending their own inspections or walkthroughs. So even though you might have had a bad taste, right? Let's say that you started off rocky. The buyer and the seller met and there was a disagreement and now the seller has a bad taste with the buyer, right? But your offer got accepted, you're in escrow, now the buyer's through their due diligence. The seller already has beef with the buyer, right? And vice versa, the buyer has beef with the seller. And I'll be the first. I've been in that circumstances. I remember buying a property out in La Habra, and I was the buyer buying the property. And ultimately, I had a little bit beef with the sellers. So it was a little awkward when I had to do my final walkthrough. I knew it was not going to be a comfortable thing because there was already exchange of situations that transpire through it. But you still hold your composure. You still need to do, and the seller cannot refuse the buyer to do their due diligence, and especially their walkthrough, even though if I was on the opposite side, I would say, no, you know what, screw this guy, right? but you cannot, right? You still have to allow the buyer to be there present with any inspections as well. Okay, so just be mindful of that. And more so as a real estate professional, your job is to be the referee, right? You don't have the buyer really talking to the sellers, right? That's why they hire you to be the advocate for these conversations, right? You between the other agent. You try to diffuse, de-escalate the situation. That's where you step in and help navigate that. Make sense? Okay. All right. So the biggest misconception, right? The buyer removes all contingencies. They cannot back out, right? So let's say you go in there with an offer, and you want this property, meaning your buyers want this property, and part of the initial elements of it is, it really just depends. But let's just say that the buyer removed the contingencies, they cannot come back, right? So the question here is, if the buyer releases contingencies, does that mean that the buyer cannot go in and do their inspections or viewing of the property? So the answer is no. You still have to allow them to do their due diligence, right? So what it says is, even after all the following access remains in place, removing contingency, actively removing the inspections or loan contingency does not waive the rights to a final verification, right? So the buyer will still be able to do their final walkthrough, right, at the end of the process, right? Waiving inspections, even if the buyer waives inspections, they retain the contractual access rights under the specific of the agreement, otherwise modified, meaning that, if there is a separate agreement, then obviously, yes, then you as a seller can refuse the buyer from coming in and doing any additional inspections.
They have access to the property, have access to property section, which typically mirrors
That's right.
the investigation window laws.
That's right. Yeah. Buying as is, right? So we all know that all properties are sold in as is conditions, right? So as is sales limit repairs obligations, but it doesn't eliminate the ability for them to do their due diligence, right? The buyer should still have the rights to see what they're buying, right? Because maybe they're doing a complete renovation, right? And they want to start getting estimates, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that that the seller cannot allow them to do their inspections, but it's more just to get an understanding, what am I getting myself into, even though they released all contingencies, right? Releasing the contingency is a good position for the seller, right? Because it means that the buyer is seriously enough that they're moving forward with the process. But it doesn't eliminate their access to the property, right? They still have the ability to go in there and do whatever they need to do in order to satisfy themselves, right? Now, when it comes to inspection contingencies, right? If you release physical inspections, right, you're basically telling the seller, hey, we're not going to do any type of inspections on the property. We're buying it as is. Maybe because it's a tear down. Maybe they're going to just eliminate the entire house. They're going to demolish it and bring it down and do new construction, or they're going to gut up the entire property, meaning they're going to just knock out all of the drywall installations, redo the plumbing and electrical, and they're going down to the studs, right? And then just building from there. They already know, and most investors already know what they're getting themselves, but you still cannot eliminate them from doing any access to the property. All right, so the 17A right of entry. So on the purchase agreement, there's a language on the grid that talks about this specific condition. And it says the following: unless otherwise modified in writing by both parties, the buyer generally has 17 days from acceptance to conduct all contractual investigations. This is a standard default on the RPA, meaning it's not a question if, or if they could, it's defaulted as part of the process. So again, when it comes to this, even though let's just say that the buyer has released contingencies, right? Physical appraisal loan, or even sometimes seller contingencies, doesn't necessarily mean that the seller can refuse the buyer from access to the property, right? They still have 17 days to go in there and see what they're buying, right? I want to see what I'm getting myself into. And during that process, they can also have their contractor as well to be there and start getting bids and estimates as well. Because you may have a contractor or two that you're trying to get estimates to see how much it's going to cost to actually renovate the property, remodel the property, or there are certain things that you're looking to do that, excuse me, you need to get some bids on it. The covered investigation include home and pests, like termite, general inspection, roof and sewer, foundations, insurance, so you may need to, because sometimes you need to figure out of the electrical panel. Right now, we're seeing a lot of issues with electrical panels. We're seeing a lot of issues with HOAs as well. We're seeing a lot of issues up in the PV area right now with everything that's going up there with the landslides. A lot of homeowner insurance are declining and denying. Or if the seller has too many claims, right? They've put a claim for this, they put a claim for this. Well, they have reports that can do a history, right, of that particular property. No difference than when you're trying to get automobile insurance, right? Let's say you bought this used car and the car is 10, 15 years old. When you're trying to get insurance, right, they run the VIN number, and that VIN number will have a track history of everything, any accidents, any mechanical issues throughout the years, and then they'll determine if they're willing to insure that vehicle or not. And if they do, it may be at a higher premium because it's had a history of issues or problems. Well, that's kind of the same thing when it comes to homeowners insurance, right? So the more claims that the seller has on the property, it's going to ding the future buyer, because when they're trying to get insurance, they're going to see like, oh gosh, we don't know if we want to insure this particular property or not. And we see this more on condominiums and townhomes that have HOA. Sometimes we share, right? Walls and all that stuff. It may not have been your particular unit, but it would have been the unit, but it may impact the plumbing. I'll give you another example. I used to own a property in El Segundo, and it was a condominium. Beautiful location. I can literally see the planes on LAX take off. Was it loud as heck? Yeah, it was super loud. But it was beautiful to see these big planes, take off from LAX. But the problem was the unit, we shared walls, but also we shared the sewer lines and plumbing. And when I started doing some renovations on it, it ultimately triggered issues with my neighbor, and that trickled down to the downstairs unit, and they started seeing water from the shower pad. So I had to get a contractor out there to basically demolish everything and start from fresh again with new plumbing as well to avoid any future. But it was like, wow, that's the problems when you're on stack from one owner to the other. You got to be very careful. And unfortunately, the contractor that I use was not too aware of all that situation, where someone else that was savvy when it comes to condominiums, they would have said, I would have done it a little different. So just be mindful of that. But going back to the 17 days right of entry. So again, if you're the listing agent, right, and the buyer goes in with contingencies removed, you still have to allow the buyer access to the property, because they may just need inspections, or they just want to go look at the property, to make sure that they're okay with it, right? Yes, Steve.
Typically, what I'd like to do when I'm a listing agent on that right of entry clause.
Yeah.
I like to make sure it gets mirrored to the investigation type frame. So for instance, if the buyer ended up putting 7 days for their investigation, but still says 17 days for the right of entry, I typically then will counter that to be 7 days as well. And the rationale behind that is I don't want that buyer inside that property any more than they need to be.
Right.
Even if they have waived contingencies, because there may be something that they now discover on one of those entry times they enter that now becomes an issue.
Yeah.
Okay, and so, and the thing that I'm trying to do as the listing agent is prevent issues from minimizing the issues that rise.
Yeah.
You know, so,
Yeah.
you know, if they broke 20, if 17 days and they had 5 days from the inspection, then the right of entry will be 5 days.
Yeah, no, good point. But also on that scope, if the seller does come across something new, problem with the property, right? That's still part of the buyer. Yeah, part of the seller's responsibility to disclose, right? Even after the buyer has released all contingencies and all inspections that they've done, if something after the fact happens, your clients cannot just refuse to divulge that information. Anything that stirs a problem with the property, you still have to disclose to the buyer. And guess what? Because this is now considered new material fact about the property, therefore the buyer has right to go in there, inspect, do whatever they need to do, and ultimately they can also ask for request of repairs, ask for a price reduction, ask for the seller to fix it, or they even have the right to cancel. But wait, Simon, they released all contingencies. Yeah, but this is something totally different now that was not known to either party, not to the seller, not to the buyer, but now it's a material fact about it. The buyer has the right 5 additional days to do their due diligence and also back out of the deal. And there's nothing that the seller can do if if the buyer decides to back out of the deal. And the buyer may say, look, you know what? It's all good. I'm good with it. We'll continue with the process. That's great. But also remember and be mindful, if you're the listing agent, that buyer and the buyer agent may come back and ask for terms. And again, remember, all properties are sold in its as-is condition. Can the seller decline that? Absolutely. But if it's a big situation, that may also give the buyer the position to back out of the deal too as well, right? So you have to be mindful about that as well. All right, let's talk about final verification before close of escrow. So remember, the contract is very defined and it already says exactly that the buyer, within 5 days of knowing of closing that deal, the buyer has the right to do what's called a final verification, right? And it's not to negotiate new terms, but it's just to make sure that the property is still in the original condition as you originally submitted an offer, and that the seller did any and all repairs that was agreed upon between the buyer and the seller during the buyer's due diligence period, right? And make sure that everything is in the up and up, nothing changed, right? And this is where we see a lot of issues too, as well, right? Because in the beginning, you saw a house with full of furniture. Maybe it was too much furniture where you weren't able to see everything. Now, 5 days before closing, seller has little by little started moving things, and now you notice something that you didn't notice before, right? And it happens quite often. One of the biggest one is mold is brought. They move a furniture that's been there for years and years, and now there's a big black spot, right? And now what happens? What do we need to do, right? Well, guess what? It's new material fact, right? The buyer wasn't able to know that was there. And the seller, being there for 20, 30 years, never moved that furniture for that time period, right? And everyone was aware. Well, the listing agent and the seller immediately, when something is compromising, that should have been immediately an alert to the buyer's agent. They should have said, "Hey, by the way, we ended up moving the furniture and we noticed that there's a big black spot there, right? Just wanted to bring it to your attention and divulge and disclose that to you." That should have been the proper thing. Instead of allowing not to say anything, the buyer then goes and does their final walkthrough and realizes this wasn't there. I don't remember seeing that. Well, you didn't, because there was a furniture there, right? So the essence of it changes the trajectory of the conversation, right? You as a listing agent need to be proactive on this and make sure that immediately, if something is not the way it should be, you immediately let the buyer's agent know so they can relay that information to the buyer. And the buyer may not care, right? But as long as you document it, you're in the best case scenario. So days before close of escrow, within 5 prior to closing, the buyer holds the contractor right to conduct a final verification of property condition. What the final verification entails is verifying and agrees to the repairs, as I mentioned, right? Confirm that any repairs negotiated in writing have contractually been completed or actually been completed. Confirm property condition, ensure no new damage has occurred since the initial inspection. So what happens if there is something that is brought up, right? Hey, I don't remember that leaky sink or leaky toilet where we hear it constantly running, right? Well, again, you note it on your verification walkthrough, and you immediately want to bring it to the listings agent's attention. Now, this is just me, and you may agree or may disagree with me, but if you're a listing agent, do you think you should be there on the final walkthrough with the buyer and the buyer agent? Okay, how many say yes? How many say no? How many say I don't know? Well, to be proactive, yeah, I want to be there with the buyer's agent and the buyer so that way I know exactly, what is being done, right? Because we don't know if, and I see that quite often where there's agents that don't show up to the final walkthrough. The lockbox is still there. The buyer's agent has the ability to go in there and they'll let the buyer and the buyer's agent do their own final walkthrough. Folks, be proactive, right? Because again, we don't know if there's anything compromised, right? And now they're bringing other layer of issues, right? But if you're there early enough, you open up the property, you can now do a physical inspection and make sure, okay, is there anything that doesn't look right? Because now you know that it was something that you saw and you can document it, let the seller know. It also let the buyer and the buyer agent when they come, hey, listen, I came in 30 minutes ago. We noticed that the toilet was leaking. So we're on it. The seller already agreed to replace the toilet or get a plumber out there to seal, whatever the case may be, right? But the essence, you want to be there as part of the final verification. In my
Especially
opinion.
sellers there, if you're the listing, you never want this, your seller there to be there with the.
That's right.
Buyer agent.
That's right. Yeah. So confirm property condition, ensure that the new damage has occurred since the initial inspection period. Verify items included. You remember, if there was a request for repairs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 were the things that the buyer was requesting get repaired. Make sure you check, right? One, oh, the water heater was supposed to be strapped. Okay, go and look at the water heater and make sure that it's strapped, right? Smoke detectors, those are one of the biggest things that we see. Make sure that the smoke detectors are where they need to be, and also the carbon monoxide detector as well. Is there, one anywhere near a gas line, right? So making sure those little touches can definitely go a long way and will avoid any delays. We don't want to delay, right? Because if we're 5 days of closing the deal, that means that the buyer can do it on the 5th, the 4th, the 3rd, and the 2nd. You don't want to do it right when you're scheduled to close the deal, right? Be proactive and make sure you're doing it way in advance, right? Because if there's any delays that may stir up, remember the seller can send a demand to close, right? You have to have a legitimate reason to delay or extend escrow from closing on time, right? And it can be something very small, right? Or it can be something very significant. Be proactive and get those inspections done sooner than later. So let's talk about as is. Does that mean no access to the property? The answer is no. One of the most frequent misconceptions in real estate, sellers who list their property as is often believe that eliminating all buyer access is also sufficient. The answer is no. Okay. We all know that all properties are sold in its as-is condition, but doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot allow the buyer to do what they need to do to make sure they're satisfied with the condition of the property, right? Okay, because yes, what as is means is that the seller is selling the property the way you see it is the way you're going to get it. We're not going to do any repairs, give any concessions in lieu of repairs. We're not going to even entertain a lower offer. Okay. So that's exactly what it means. It's like You want it. This is the condition of the property. We divulge everything to you. Buyer, you have every right to do your due diligence. And if you want it, great. And if you don't, we're not going to entertain any type of concessions. And that's okay. But here's the big picture, right? If this is the only offer, and you've had this property now for 45 days, you want to hang on to that buyer, right? Because if this buyer falls out of escrow, we don't know when the next buyer is going to come, right? Your job is what? To sell the property, right? That's your number one goal, right? And now if this deal falls apart, now we have to go back into doing open houses, uh, putting it back to active on the MLS, right? And we just do not anticipate or know when the next buyer is going to come, right? So be mindful about these circumstances when it comes to as is, right? So what is as is actually means, right? The seller is generally not agreeing to make any repairs. As a result of the buyer's investigation, the buyer accepts the property in its current condition with full knowledge of the inspections revealed. So even if the buyer does all of their inspections, physical, plumbing, electrical, roof, foundation, this, all of them, right? And there's issues, major stuff, right? The buyer can still move forward with it. The buyer may still ask for some type of concession, but the seller can say, look, I told you the property is in its as is condition. We're not going to do any of it. So take it for what it is or decide to cancel. Now, what is the benefit of trying to make this a deal to work, right? It's when the seller's willing to bend a little bit, right? Because if you're too hard stop on it, well, it may fear the buyer, and the buyer may decide to back out of the deal. This is what we call the win-win situation, right? And I've seen circumstances too, and I tell you because I see it all the time, is I've seen it on the MLS. Do not ask for any repairs whatsoever, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. Agents, do not ask in your counter offers or your request of repairs. And then when you see it on the counter offer, it says property sold as is, do not ask for any repair requests, right? We're not going to do it. And then the buyer still does their due diligence and they say, well, they told me we cannot do anything. Does that mean you cannot ask? Okay. Yeah, you can definitely ask. I want to poke the bears, even though the bear, if you poke the bear, is going to bite, right? But, you have a fiduciary duty. Yes, they told you they're not willing to do anything, but pros and cons, ladies and gentlemen, if you really think about it, this is why I enjoy negotiations, is because when they say a hard no, my job is to try to wiggle myself to say a soft yes. It may not be everything, but they may consider it because one, they don't want to start all over again. The seller doesn't want to start over with no certainty that they're going to get the same offer, the same terms, or the conditions, right? So it may be to the seller's advantage to say, you know what, if they're really thinking about it, maybe I should just bend a little bit and allow some type of concessions to the buyer. I won't do, $20,000, but I'm willing to throw $5,000 to make this deal work. Okay. And I've seen circumstances where it was a hard no in the beginning. It was in writing, as is, buyer, we're not doing any repairs, to a soft yes, where they say, you know what? It's a legitimate, what do you call it? A legitimate, thank you. A legitimate request. This is why I love you guys. A legitimate request. And, sometimes the seller will just go for it because they can see the bigger picture. We're 15, 16 days in. We're halfway through escrow. Do I want to start over with uncertainty, or at least give some incentive to the buyer that they feel comfortable and agreeable to continue? And now we only have another 15 days to get this deal close to the finish line. Does that make sense, right? So you got to look at the bigger picture. What is as is that does not eliminate, right? So inspection rights. Buyer may still inspect during the contingency. Just because they release it, they can still do their inspections, folks, okay? So it doesn't mean a hard no, You release the inspection, so you cannot do any inspection. Okay. What they're saying when the buyer relieves physical inspection is they're not going to ask for anything. That's what it really means is, look, I still have the right to do my inspections, but we're going to buy it still without requesting, right? And even if the buyer says, look, I released that as a condition, but I still need some requests of repair money. Can the buyer do so? Answer is yeah. Remember, it's the give and take. Circumstances, situations change on a consistent basis. What I said in the beginning may change differently later. Okay. And the beautiful thing, ladies and gentlemen, is even if you're the listing agent, be firm and stern on that, right? You released that as a condition. You knew what you were getting. We allowed you the opportunity under the contract to do your inspections, but unfortunately, we're not going to entertain any of your requests. Okay. Can the buyer back out of the deal when the buyer released that as a condition? Can they use that as a condition to back out of the deal? Yeah. Depends on the circumstances. So I can argue as a listing agent and say, well, Steve, you released the physical inspection, meaning that you knew what you were getting. Yeah, we gave you the right to do your inspections, but you released that. So that's not a good reason for you to back out of the deal.
Well, they can still back out, but they've got the issues.
When releasing the physical inspection?
They can back out subject to the potential loss of deposit.
Yes. Okay. So you're 2 steps ahead of me. So yeah. So the ability is that, yeah, you know what? The deal can still fall apart, even though the buyer's requesting, you release that as part of the contingencies. And yeah, you know what? You're not going to refuse the buyer from backing out, right? But they also cannot use that as an ammunition to try to argue the fact about their earnest deposit as well, to Steve's point, because you got to look at it from all faucets. This is the reason buyers have protections, and these protections are these contingencies: physical inspection, seller disclosures, appraisal, loan contingencies, HOAs, insurances, and all that fun stuff, right? That's the buyer's layer of protection. Every contingency that they release exposes the buyer's earnest deposit, right? And if you release that and you're trying to use that as a way to back out, well, okay, you can back out, but we're going to challenge you and we're going to still try to go after your earnest deposit. Make sense? All right, so let's talk about real scenarios here, right? The reluctant seller. I don't want anyone inside my home. I've accepted the offer. That should be enough. The situation arises when more often than agents expect. Let's walk through the key questions every agent should be able to answer confidently, right? Can the buyer still inspect, right? Potentially, yes. The purchase agreement grants the buyer the right to conduct investigations during the contingency period, regardless of seller's preference. Okay. Can the appraiser enter? Generally, yes. Lender appraisers are typically a condition of the buyer's financials ability to obtain a loan and cannot be blocked by the sellers unilaterally. Meaning, remember, as I said, as the original scenario, what if this deal was a cash offer? Okay. But the buyer had that appraisal contingency, right? Well, that's their ability to try to negotiate, right? And if they had held on to the appraisal contingency, and let's say that the appraisal came in $100,000 less than what they offer, that's a position that they can try to renegotiate different terms. And if they don't get what the buyer's requesting, guess what? The buyer has a right to exercise a cancellation because they're using that as ammunition. Excuse me, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I'm using the appraisal contingency as part of the process. And, I'm glad I did because I didn't know I was overpaying for a property, right? That's the beautiful thing of an appraisal, right? It's an opinion of value, right? Can the insurance company inspect? Potentially, yes. Insurance inspections are often required for buyers to obtain homeowners coverage in a standard loan condition, right? Depends on the circumstances, depends on the type of insurance company that you're using. but it's far and few that we see insurance companies go out there. Mostly, I remember the early 2000s, insurance were doing this quite often at the earthquake shut-off valves. That was one of the conditions. I remember it many times. It's like the insurance, and it also depends on the carrier. You know, at
one of the big ones.
what's that?
AAA is one of the big ones.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, it was Allstate. Allstate was really a stickler when it came to it. It's like we had to spend additional money to get those earthquake shut-off valves, right? And what, you know, most of you probably know what it is. In case of an earthquake, they attach this little red gizmo that when the earth shakes, there's a little bubble that will allow the gas to shut off and not allow the gas to go into the house, right? And it's just a really a protection. That was one of the conditions that most insurance companies require, and then strapping the water heater too, right? So what if you have a tankless water heater? Do you need to strap that? Okay. Does anyone know what a tankless water heater is? So it's basically, yeah, it's a tankless water heater is that it's not a big drum that holds, 50, 60 gallons of water, right? It filters quick. I mean, it's high pressure, intense heat already that allows the water to come in and heat up the water immediately into to the house. But those are typically already boxed in and strapped in and secured on the wall. So. All right. Can the buyer do a final walkthrough? Yes, the RPA allows it, right? So part of the condition is that, yeah, you know what? Once the deal is about to get close to closing, the buyer has every right to do a final walkthrough. Now, let me ask you this scenario, okay? The scenario is, and I think we're going to touch on this a little bit, but let's just say that the buyer has released all contingencies. 17 days came, right? 17 days came, and buyer released all contingencies, loan, physical, seller disclosures, appraisals, you name it, all of it, right? And now the buyer is asking, hey, I forgot one inspection. We're asking the seller to allow us to do an inspection. Now we're 22 days into escrow. Can the listing agent and the seller refuse the buyer to do an inspection after the buyer has released all inspection contingency? How many say yes? Okay. How many say no? How many say I don't know? Okay. So again, it really depends on the circumstances, right? Now, my opinion, and this is just my opinion, once the buyer releases all contingencies, right? They've had their time period to do any and all. That's why it defaults to 17 days, right? 17 days is the sweet spot that, hey, do all of your inspections. You got 17 days. If you want to do back to back to back inspections, by all means, go at it, right? But once I release that condition and you're satisfied with the overall, and now you're coming back after the fact to request an additional inspection, well, I think the seller can refuse. I really believe that the seller can refuse and says, look, you had your time period to do any and all. We're not going to allow you to do any more inspections because now it feels like what else are they trying to use now as ammunition to either try to back out of the deal, try to figure out, oh, well, you know what? We're not going to be able to buy this property. Let's go see if we can find something else that we can use as ammunition, right? No, it may be too late. You had your time period to do all inspections. Therefore, we're not going to allow you to do it. But when we're 5 days prior to close of escrow, if you want to do your final walkthrough, you're more to do so. But by that time, you're set, right? You should be ready to fund and close this deal. So just be mindful of that. So limited access becomes a problem, right? A seller who refuses or significant limits the contractual access of after acceptance isn't just being difficult. They may be in breach of the purchase agreement with serious consequences. So the breach of contract, refusing access is a direct violation of the seller's obligation under the contract. Yeah, absolutely. So you either, if you're going to be in breach of the contract, then we have every right to cancel and retain our full deposit, right? So you cannot be in that position when the buyer has the right to do so, right, you may be in breach. Delay contingency removal. If the buyer cannot inspect, they cannot remove their contingency period, right? Stalling the transaction is indefinite, right? So I am trying to get my buyers to do their inspections, right? But we may have a difficult seller or a difficult tenant, right? That are not allowing us to do our inspections, right? And that may happen, right? It's like their chains are making it very difficult. And now it's 15 days, 16 days, 17 days. And 17 days, we're supposed to remove it. The listing agent cannot send us a notice to perform when we have not had the opportunity or the ability to do any inspections because the seller or a tenant has made it very difficult to allow access to the property. How can we do our due diligence, right? How can we get our inspections, know the condition of the property when it's been difficult to even access the home? Does that make sense? Okay. Delay in closing. Access disputes can push escrow closing dates, costing both the parties money in rate blocks, moving costs, and carrying costs, right? Remember, this is the reason we have a 30-day escrow, right? And there's rate locks, there's money exchange and escrow, right? And any delays can definitely be a cost to the buyer or vice versa, cost to the seller as well, right? They may be purchasing another property, they're up leg, right? Selling their home, but buying another property. They are under the pressure too to close on deal because they need the funds to be able to close on their up leg, right? So in essence, it can be like a chain train reaction is you got to make sure you're following the initial process and staying on track because any delays may impact the up leg as well. And mutual cancellation or legal claims, right? Buyer whose access rights are denied may pursue cancellation, deposit refund, and potential file claim against the seller. Absolutely, right? So the essence is there's a word that is not used, it's not heard often, but can the buyer force the seller to sell? Can the buyer force the seller to sell?
Two words.
Yeah. Okay. It's not a very tricky question. It's just, can I, as a buyer, say, look, you're making it difficult. I want this property. You accepted my offer. You accepted my terms. You're making it very difficult. Now you're delaying the process. Can I force the seller? Meaning, can I force the seller to sell the property? The answer is yes. There's a word called specific performance. Okay. Now, specific performance is only done through the court system and it has to be through an attorney. We as real estate agents do not have that power. Sorry, folks, we don't. But the buyer has the right to get legal counsel, speak with an attorney, explain the circumstance and situation. And if there's enough meat in that bone, then yeah, they can articulate and really go after the seller to force the sale. In my career, I think I've been in 3 specific performance, 2 in this office. Okay, so it happens, and ultimately, um, can you force and if what happens if the buyer ends up winning, but they're still adamant about the situation, right? Well, there's a lien against the property. Okay, so that means that the seller cannot sell the property. The seller cannot refinance because we have a lien against the property. So even though we're saying we can force the sale, which most sellers will bend and says, look, it's not worth it, let's just go ahead and sell it. But also we can't, even though the language or the wording may sound ambiguous, right? You still not force someone, but you can put a lien against that property. That's what specific performance means, that now it ties the property. So maybe they're not ready to sell, but in 2 years, 3 years, they're going to have to come back to us and says, the seller needs to sell. Okay, well, we're going to get notification, and that's exactly what happened. We ended up doing a transaction when our agents represented the buyer. Buyer ended up getting legal counsel, and they went through the motions, got a specific performance claim against the seller, and ultimately put a lien against the property. The seller was adamant, did not want to sell the property. And then 3 years later, they totally forgot they wanted to sell the property. Oh, by the way, you have a lien. What lien? Well, the lien that you have with a previous buyer 3 years earlier. So I can't sell the property? No. So they needed to talk to us. And guess what? The buyer still wanted the property. So guess what? The buyer ended up buying the property, not 3 years earlier, but 3 years later. Okay, it happens. It happens.
Typically, you have that conversation with your buyers when you're having the conversation with your deposits.
Yep.
Of what happens when a buyer backs out of the sale. And typically your buyer will go back to you and say, well, what happens? What do I get if the seller were to back out? Unfortunately, there's no initial monetary monies like there is from buyers to sellers. And that's where you talk to them, well, if that were to happen, you'd have to seek legal counsel for a potential specific performance.
That's right.
Which forces the sale.
That's right.
This is actually a legal term.
That's right.
Okay, meaning abiding by the terms of the contract.
That's right. Yeah. Cool. All right. So can an agent draft special limited language? The short answer is no. Real estate agents are not authorized to rewrite or modify pre-printed provisions on the car forms, right? The residential purchase agreement. Only legal counsel should draft legal language or modification, inspection rights, entry rights, and contingencies and seller's obligations, right? Agents who draft custom legal language risk DRE complaints and professional liability. Always refer to legal counsel or the brokerage in general, right? So don't go in there thinking you're clever because you use Chat GPT and it's giving you some type of language in there that, yeah, this sounds good. And then you submit it, right? No, right? We're not attorneys. Be mindful and cautious, right? If everything sounds a little iffy, immediately bring it to our attention. We have attorneys in place that then we can relay this, let them draft whatever language or proposal. So that way you clean your hands. We as a brokerage clean our hands, but then now it's between the principals and the attorneys involved. Okay. What agents can and cannot do, right? So understanding the boundaries between real estate guidance and legal advice is very, very, very critical, right? So agents can explain the existing contracts, right? We can go through the motions and explain, so here's the do's, here are the don'ts regarding the document itself, right? So explain the existence of the agreement. Now, with the agreement, there's constant changes, right? I always say that every year there's 2 revisions, right? They either add new documents, remove specific language, add different language to specific forms, stuff of the nature. And that usually happens in June, and it also happens in December. Now, disregard the next one, which discusses the car form. This was more during COVID time. And apologize for this information, but reference to the PED, right? So the PED was part of the process, during COVID. So disregard that. Recommend legal counsel, refer clients to a real estate attorney when the situation involves potential. Now, can we as real estate agents ask the buyer or the seller, hey, I think it might be best to maybe speak with your attorney or a attorney, okay? Can you do that? Yeah, absolutely. I would encourage, even when they're upset and they're threatened to say, well, if not, I'm going to have to talk to my attorney. By all means, please. Sometimes they're just bluffing. And you know how many times I've been in those circumstances? I think on a daily basis, they're always threatening that they're going to get legal involved. Even better. I love to talk to your attorney. Okay. And I talk to attorneys quite often as well. Sometimes they're the nicest people and sometimes they're the worst people as well. So I get them both, right? But yes, absolutely. As licensed real estate professionals, remember, you're only selling real estate, helping buyers into a real estate property. Under no circumstances are you giving any type of legal advice, right? Because that can come back to us. Okay. All right, so agents cannot rewrite language, draft custom clauses, right? And again, I do this quite often. There's times that, we need to have specific language as long as it's clear, concise, and it doesn't cross the boundary of legal advice, right? Because I would always encourage, I think this is something that the buyer should speak with their attorney. This is something that I advise that they speak with, the seller speak with an attorney, right? Because again, it may compromise, right? This is the reason, you know that these contracts, when I mean the California Association of Realtors contract, it's a protection for us. Okay. I can tell you that even if I don't know anything in these documents as a licensed agent, I know that CAR is protecting us. Okay. So utilize those forms, right? Don't go using any wazoo type of agreements that you had ChatGPT do, because that might expose liability as well. Okay, this is why we use those forms, because it protects us, it protects the buyer, and it protects the seller, to a certain extent as well. But when something doesn't align, then we always tell them it's time to have you speak with legal. Examples of attorney drafted access limitations, again, exterior inspections only, no inspections, right? You cannot say you cannot do any inspections, right? Appraisal, access, HOA inspections, government inspections, and home inspections only. So the essence of this draft is just to understand that, we as real estate professionals, when it comes to access the property, we have to be very careful in how we navigate the position, because we cannot. And it's, again, to the seller's advantage to allow them to do their due diligence within their contractual rights, right? And it can be tight as, not 17 days, but, after doing counter offers, we say, yeah, buyer, you have 10 days or 6 days or 8 days. And if they agree to it, then you have, that time frame to do your due diligence, right? But it already defaults to 17 days. Okay. So quick post inspection. So the situation, inspections are done. I don't want the buyer back in my house again, right? The seller instructs the listing agent to deny the buyer's request for a final walkthrough, right? Believing that the obligation ends when the inspection period was closed, right? The legal reality is, can the seller refuse? Generally speaking, no. The RPA explicit provides that the buyer within the right to conduct a final verification of the property and conduct within that 5 day of the schedule. Now, let me ask you this question. Can a buyer waive the right to a final walkthrough? How many say yes? How many say no? How many say, I don't know? Okay, so the answer is yeah. The buyer has the right to waive the right to do a final walkthrough, meaning they can refuse it, but it has to be the buyer's choice. The buyer has to tell us, and we have to document it on the form itself. There's a section that says buyer waives the right to a final walkthrough. And as long as we have that checked and initialed and signed by the buyer, then you're good. You're good to go. You're golden. Then you don't have to do a final walkthrough. And most people do so when they're out of state. They're not going to come one day to do a final walkthrough. They're just going to take the motions of waiving that right, and that's perfectly fine as well. What is the final verification for? It confirms repairs were completed, no new damage occur, and all included items remain. Not to renegotiate. Remember, the final walkthrough is not to renegotiate, right? But it's just to really see that the property is still in the same condition as you originally saw it and submitted an offer, right? What should the listing agent do? Advise the seller of their contractual obligations, document the conversation, and refer to legal counsel if the seller insists on refusing access. Remember, again, the buyer has the right to do their final walkthrough. You cannot refuse them to do so. Broker risk, what's at stake, right? So if an agent tells a seller, you don't have to let them in, right? So never do that, right? That's not your job. That's not your responsibility. Because if you do so, you're in breach of the contract. Agents has advised the seller to violate a material term of the purchase agreement, right? DR complaint, advise the client in breach that the obligations can result in a complaint to the Department of Real Estate, right? And that's a serious case, right? Or if an investigator with the Department of Real Estate is now investigating your file, right? And you breach that, you may be dealing with the Department of Real Estate and potentially risking your real estate license. Errors and omission insurance too. The agent errors and omission insurance carries may be drawn, right? If there's some monetary damage because you're refusing, and now there's a claim that the buyer ended up closing, and now there's $100,000 worth of issues that the buyer didn't have the ability to do so, yeah, they're going to come after us. They're going to go heavy on this and try to get our legal involved in the circumstances. And then obviously there's an arbitration litigation. Listing agent may be named in an arbitration lawsuit as well. We never want to be named in any type of lawsuits, right? It's just, again, if we can avoid it, we want to avoid it like the plague. Best practice, again, before listing, set the expectations with the seller, explain that the buyer has the right to final verification, which is again, what is as is, and not that refusing the buyer the right to do their inspections. At offer acceptance, remind that the seller of their access obligations under paragraph 12A, that the buyer has still access, even though they release physical inspections, you cannot deny them their access to the property. Disregard the PED near close, make sure that the buyer has the right to do their final verification. And when arises contract legal, remember, if there's any issues, you immediately want to bring it to our attention, or ask the buyer or the seller to speak with their attorneys. And then final, buyers have the contractual rights. Removing contingencies loses access. Doesn't mean that access as is has limitations. Remember, as is limit repairs obligations only. Inspection rights, access rights, and final verification remain intact. Limited entry can breach the contract. A seller who blocks access without written attorney approval, modification risk, and material breach of the purchase agreement, and when in doubt, involve legal rights and the broker as well. And we'll go ahead and skip this, but if we had a little bit more time, we would have had a discussion around have you had a seller refuse entry and all that fun stuff. So with that, closing thoughts, make sure you're educating yourself early, make sure you document everything and know your limit and rights when it comes to the initial process, right? Because in essence this can go sideways really, really quick, and you want to make sure that you nip it immediately and know to bring the leadership involved, and more so if we need to also bring the attorneys involved for risk management to kind of help us navigate this, then that's why you're part of a big organization. Okay, with that, any final questions? Anyone on Zoom have any questions?